Good evening to all of you who are making your way in from the waiting room. We'll wait just a few more minutes for folks to get logged on, and then we'll get started momentarily. All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this webinar, Churches and Climate Change After Helene. I see folks are still trickling in, but we'll go ahead and get started. I'm Andy Thompson. I'm the director of the Center for Religion and Environment here at Sewanee, at the School of Theology at the University of the South, where I also teach ethics. And I'm thrilled to be able to introduce my two panelists this evening. First is the Right Reverend Brian Cole. Bishop Cole is the fifth bishop of the Diocese of East Tennessee. He's a member of the Board of Regents here at Sewanee. He, in addition to being responsible for the whole eastern part of the state of Tennessee and the churches there, he also has lived in North Carolina, in Black Mountain, and in the Asheville area. So his experiences of Hurricane Helene, he's had a lot of firsthand encounters with that, and he has a lot of deep connections all throughout that area. And so he's going to be speaking some about that, about his own experience of that, and about what the church is seeing there. My other guest this evening is Sarah McIntyre. Sarah is the Sustainability Coordinator in the Office of Environmental Stewardship and Sustainability here at Sewanee. And in that capacity, Sarah was one of the main authors of Sewanee's Climate Accountability Plan, first in 2022, and I understand she's currently in the process of updating that. And that's really the Sewanee's main action-oriented plan for how we respond to the challenges of climate change as an institution. And so in that capacity, Sarah has a lot of experience thinking about both institutionally and in communities, how we can respond to climate change and build adaptability and resilience. Before we go any further, I'm going to post in the chat a link to the Diocese of East Tennessee's hurricane webpage. There you'll see some photos and a message from Bishop Cole about the impact of Hurricane Helene in the diocese, and you also have an opportunity to donate to those recovery efforts. So I encourage everybody to take a look at that link to learn more about what the impacts and the recovery look like there, as we'll be hearing more from Bishop Brian, and also to contribute to those efforts if you can. The motivation for this webinar is a sense that I think Hurricane Helene, and even to a lesser degree, Hurricane Milton shortly after it, brought climate change home to many of us in a new way, or in new ways. And we've seen a number of news stories to that effect, reflecting on what the impacts of Hurricane Helene that we're seeing in East Tennessee and Western North Carolina, how the severity and the geography of those impacts were unexpected and surprising, and kind of raised new aspects of climate change, or at least reinforced things that we maybe were perhaps aware of, but are now thinking about in different ways. And so the hope for this webinar is to think about what we can learn from that experience for communities, and particularly for church communities. Are there things that we should be thinking about differently, or things that we should be doing differently? Or did these hurricanes just reinforce what we already knew, or perhaps give us new angles on things that we already knew? And also, what does it mean to be the church in this context? Does being the church in a world of climate change mean something distinctive? Does the church have a distinctive voice or distinctive contribution to make in that area? So those are all things that I'm going to be inviting my guests to think with us about tonight. A couple more just logistical points. We are recording this webinar, and so if you have to leave, or if you know someone else who would be interested in this and want to share that at a later time, that will be available. And we'll send out the link to the recording to everybody who's participating now, as well as to some of our mailing lists. So folks will have access to that. But just be aware that the webinar is being recorded. We will have an opportunity for question and answer later on in the hour. And we do expect the webinar to last approximately an hour. So later on in our time together, we'll have an opportunity for some question and answer. And there's a Q&A function that we'll ask you to use that if you have questions for our panelists. And I will be monitoring those, and I'll pass those along to the panelists. There is also a chat that you'll have access to, that everybody will see, but we do ask you to use the Q&A so we can keep those questions sort of located in one place. And it appears that I see a hand up already. So if you have a question already, or something you'd like to mention just as we're kicking things off, please go ahead and put that in the chat or in the Q&A as appropriate. Sarah, Brian, first, thank you all so much for being with us this evening. We're really grateful for your time and your insight and your experiences that you're going to share. I think to start things off, Brian, would you tell us some about what you experienced when you traveled to the area that was impacted by Helene, what you saw there, and what that experience was like?
Sure. Andy, thank you for putting this together. Sarah, it's nice to meet you. Sorry for the reason, but it's good to meet you, and I'm grateful for your work at Sewanee. So Hurricane Helene, at this point, I've had two primary ways of engaging Helene. The Sunday after Helene passed through the area, I went to Kingsport for a Sunday visitation, and then traveled over to Elizabethton to see damage in Carter County. So I had the ability to kind of be on the ground with our priest and parish folk there, and saw some firsthand impact. For me, I guess what was the most impactful in this time, the Monday after that, Helene hit, had a chance to do a helicopter ride from Knoxville, and went over both East Tennessee, and then asked the helicopter pilot if we could see Western North Carolina because of family and professional connections to Black Mountain and Swannanoa and Asheville. For me, what was remarkable about that experience, I'd never been in a helicopter before. So on the one hand, to see the incredible beauty of the Appalachian Mountains and why we love this place and why it holds us so. So to see the beauty of the mountains, and then to come over an area and to see Irwin, and to see Newport, and to see Greenville, and to see places of deep impact and hurt, and then to go to Swannanoa and Black Mountain and Asheville and see places that I knew and couldn't really recognize. And so it was you're seeing devastation, and you're seeing what water can do, what floods can do, what hurricane impact can do. It was hard. And 20 years ago, I was on the clergy staff at All Souls in Asheville when Hurricane Francis and Hurricane Ivan did sort of back-to-back September visits. And at that time, we thought that was historic, once in a century. And obviously, what Helene did in comparison to Francis and Ivan is of such a larger scale that it's hard to get your head around. So yeah, I had a chance to see visually just the impact, again, both the beauty of the mountains and what Helene has done to ravage it.
Yeah, thank you. Um, Sarah, can you say a little bit about what was different about Helene, what it indicates about climate change that may be new or different from what we've seen before?
Sure. Thank you, Andy, for having me, and thank you, Brian, for the work that you're doing in those impacted areas. So Helene, I think the biggest thing that Helene has done for us in terms of climate change is it's really brought home that to those who maybe haven't been as engaged in this work is that climate change really is happening. It's here, it's real, it's not a future incident that we're working to change. It's a present instance that is happening now. And I think the other piece about Helene is that it caught so many people off guard. And so I think the tricky piece about climate change is that we've done so much modeling, right? That you can be like, well, we predict that this is going to happen in this time frame and this is going to happen in this time frame, and you kind of hear like, okay, well, my region's going to get drier, or my region's going to get wetter, or the storms are going to be more severe. But what we can't easily model, though we continue to say, is that not only are the severities of these incidents going to increase, the destruction of them and the frequency of them is going to increase, but also there's a piece that is unpredictable, right? Like we are trying to plan for unpredictable futures. And I think that really is the piece of climate change that Helene has brought home to us. This devastation happened in a space that we thought of as a climate haven, right? And it, it is not, right? And so I think that's really the grappling that many of us are doing now is, oh my goodness, not only is this bad, but it's bad in unpredictable ways.
Yeah, I'll say that was the thing that struck me the most, being here in Sewanee on top of a plateau in Middle East Tennessee. I've always thought, yeah, obviously I'm aware of the severity and the urgency of climate change, but when it started happening, when flooding started happening in Western North Carolina and East Tennessee, in places that had been thought of as climate havens, that was the thing that hit me. Like, no place is really excluded. No place is really a climate haven. Brian, as Bishop of East Tennessee, did you anticipate that you would be dealing with climate refugees and firsthand impacts of climate change?
So what's interesting is I've now been bishop for 7 years, and the province four bishops, so those are the bishops of the Southeast, we meet together with some regularity. And when we meet together, there's always that half a day that in the past I could skip because they were talking about church insurance and hurricanes. So I knew that's South Carolina, that's Florida, coastal Georgia, Gulf of Mexico. So I thought, I can go, have a free time. And what I was already aware of, and I think this is both Western North Carolina and East Tennessee. I mean, at this point, we're already seeing climate refugees, right? We're already seeing folks who are saying that's my last hurricane in South Carolina, who were moving to East Tennessee or who were moving to Western North Carolina. I think the New York Times had an article where folks said, I actually moved here to be a part of climate change resilience, right? And my house got swept away by a hurricane. So I do think it's sobering, but I do think Helene lets us know we're all in this, right? Some places are going to have much more direct impact, but to somehow think I'm going to move to some place that is free of this is not going to happen. I was in South Dakota last Sunday, talking to farmers who knew I was from East Tennessee, who were curious about the hurricanes. And I was talking about how much rain we got. and they've just had their driest, hottest September ever, right? They're like, could we get any of that? Could that rain get, and so South Dakota is not dealing with hurricane damage, but they're dealing with damage, and significant damage. So yeah, I think Helene lets us know there's no place that's somehow a climate haven.
Yeah. So our focus tonight, of course, is on Helene, but I want to mention briefly Milton, which followed so closely after Helene. Does that add anything? Does that give us anything different or anything new that we hadn't seen before?
I think it does. From a climate perspective, I mean, just how quickly that storm escalated, right? Like that was bringing meteorologists to tears, right? It pops up and then it escalates so very, very quickly. And it is escalating in ways that are crippling to our early warning and early detection systems in order that we rely on to keep people safe in these areas that are hurricane prone. We rely on evacuation and preparedness. And I think what Milton showed us is, wow, we won't be able to prepare.
Yeah.
I think Milton, there's also just the what it does to the soul, right?
Mm.
Um, and sense of despair, in a sense of that we don't get to do one thing at a time. And so I think one thing tonight, I want to make sure while we talk about what's going on in these storms, all the more the work that Sarah's doing at Sewanee around long-term planning, we still have to do that, right? And we're going to have folks impacting on storms who might feel like, that's some luxury to do that. We have to respond to the storm, and we have to find a way to respond to the storm and say, and we have to do the long-term planning. We have to be a people that believe there's another world and it's already here, right? And we're preparing for that world. But I think Milton is just, yeah, it's just you can't catch your breath. And I think we have to be prepared for not being able to catch our breath. All the more we have to have people supporting each other.
Mhm.
Thanks for that point. It brings to mind one of the things too that I found really striking in some of the coverage about Helene was the way that certain decisions about zoning, development, the way the land was being used really led to a lot of the impacts, or at least made a lot of the impacts worse um, than they otherwise would have been in Western North Carolina and East Tennessee. And so I think that raises, Brian, to your point about preparedness, about thinking long term, that while we often think of climate change and climate politics in very global terms, but sometimes there are very immediate kind of local decisions and questions that affect that planning, our ability to be ready, to be able to respond.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, and this is this is almost like a Sarah question from me. I realize if you're on the coast of Florida, one way you prepare is you make sure you have hurricane resistant roofs, right? But I'm curious what it means to think about climate change preparation in places where it's not just a matter of can your roof sustain a storm? It's also what are other ways to think about how we build, where we build, that have some real respect for climate change. And like you said, it's not at some point going to be here like we're living in it, right? For so long we've said, the church is changing. At some point the church will be different. Like, no, we're living in the midst of the change. It's not somewhere out there, it's here, which makes it again harder to talk about.
Yeah, that is very true and perceptive. So I think when we think about climate change, and how we prepare for it, it's so there's the mitigation side, right? Which is like we need to limit the climate changing greenhouse gases that we are emitting now. Severely and now and globally. And so there's a bunch of work that can happen there, right? There's a bunch of policy work that can happen there. There's also a bunch of kind of infrastructure work that can happen there. We can think about how we're building our buildings and how we're getting our energy and how we're using our energy and how much we're using our energy, right? All of that, it falls into the mitigation bucket. And then there's also this kind of adaptation, recovery, coping bucket, which, if you look at coping and recovery, it's what is our ability to withstand damage and withstand these conditions? Can we, putting your house on stilts, right, is a way to withstand that damage or to cope with that change. But then also, how do we then bounce back better? So how do we not have to only rely on FEMA? How do we build these communities that are tight-knit and resilient within each other that you're seeing, I'm sure, in East Tennessee and Western North Carolina? And you could probably talk a lot about how more than just FEMA has come together and all of them and kind of that patchwork quilt. But then we're thinking about like, well, how do we adapt for an uncertain future? And that again there's a policy bucket, right? Where you can think, okay, well, these are policies that we need to put in place. For example, building codes, right? If we say you only have to build things to a 50-year flood level instead of to a 100 or a 500-year flood level, that's going to dramatically impact when and how those systems fail, if they're going to fail in extreme events, right? It dramatically impacts how that flooding could compare. Or when we think about reservoirs and how much water we're allowed to take from groundwater reservoirs or from above ground reservoirs, that is again like a drought preparedness, right? Like where we're thinking about like, well, we used to think that rainfall fell in this average window and we could draw and we could maintain a positive balance. How do we change that? And so those are kind of broad spectrums. But then you also think about buildings and you think about ecosystems, right? So there's also the ecosystem piece of how do we think about our landscapes and what do we need to put in place in terms of marshes versus seawalls? How do we think about forests and farmlands? How do we think about our green spaces? And can we recognize them as advocates and players along with us in our kind of mitigation as well as our adaptation lenses? So it kind of just depends on what bucket you're interested in working in, but I think all of those have to come together, and that's how we build resilience.
Thank you for all that information, Sarah. That's really helpful. And I'll point out that in the chat, one of the participants has expressed some gratitude for that information as well. Said that was really helpful. And I really appreciate the thinking about ecosystems, wetlands, marshes as co-players in this, as agents alongside of us. And I think there's a lot of really interesting philosophical and theological kind of ways of approaching those questions. And maybe we'll get a chance to get into some of those things a little bit. But thanks for raising that image. I think that's a wonderful way to think about that. Brian, Sarah mentioned sort of communities responding and how communities can show up for one another, how they can be systems of support in these kinds of situations. Have you seen some of that in East Tennessee or Western North Carolina?
I have. And, again, I think, in the aftermath of a storm, so often we do see the best in people, right? People of faith, people without faith, people just respond with money, with help, showing up, chainsaws, So on the one hand, there's always that wonderful, it's that wonderful response of realizing people want to help. And we've gotten, whether it's been significant financial support or people saying, where can I go to help? Are thinking through kind of how we realize this storm doesn't simply stop at a diocesan border. So how will we help our neighbors in Western North Carolina or Georgia where this happened? Folks are doing remarkable things. And I'm talking to a lot of friends in Asheville and Swano and Black Mountain, all the ways in which both governmental faith groups, neighborhood groups, yeah, folks responding in all kinds of ways, which again is heartening. And this goes back to some of Sarah's pieces. How do we preload some of that care and concern to say, what are the ways we can respond so that can we take maybe a tenth of that helping energy and put it into mitigation and proactive public policy that that then is another way to express that kind of love and care and concern, right? And I think that's where we all of us don't do a good enough job of making that kind of case. When people see hurt, they want to respond and help. It's hard to explain to them you can't see the hurt, but it's there, right? You can't see the ways in which poor building, poor development, poor resource decisions really do impact and really prepare you for what's going to be a historic hurricane until the next one, right?
So are you thinking then of advocacy, sort of political organizing, that kind of those kinds of steps for increasing preparedness, resilience?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's all of that. Again, I think it's also just a sense of, you know, and I do think this again, this whole issue of climate change, and Sarah was so helpful to say this, we're already in it, right? But again, I think so often if there's a thing we want to deny, you know, the church is changing, a family dealing with addiction, climate change, we can find ways to say, you know, it might come to us as opposed to we're living in the crisis. And so I think it's hard to say we're living in the crisis because again, that makes us anxious, that makes us afraid. So yeah, I think to think through the ways in which all of us can help craft, plan, inhabit the world we want to live in, and then back out. So how do we get there, right? And again, knowing that when the storm comes, we don't say, well, now this is a luxury. It's like all the more that you double down to say we have to be thinking about this.
Mhm. One thing that I have seen a lot of research around that I think can be a distinctive contribution perhaps for the church is evidence that community resilience, those strong relationships, you know, that sense of, I mean, sometimes just knowing who is where and what needs they have, those sort of things, that really is one of the keys to climate resilience. And certainly there are other organizations that can do that besides the church, but it seems like a natural niche for the church to fill in terms of developing resilience, in terms of building communities that really are capable of responding with some flexibility, with some resilience, you know, not knowing exactly what the impacts are going to be, but being able to strengthen those relationships, to have a sense of what resources and what capacities are in the community and sort of how to access those, of who to care for and how to care for them. Um, and that too, as sort of as you described, Brian, is something that churches can do and maybe don't always do as well as they could. You know, of really being enmeshed in the community, of being um, you know, well enough connected to know sort of what all of those things, what those needs and what those assets are. I wonder if either of you have thoughts about sort of how churches might be able to contribute to that kind of resilience.
I'll just say, obviously, churches can be very much a part of that. It'll be important for us then to get a sense of, and this is where I hope the Episcopal Church can help, a sense of thinking of what it means to belong to a parish, right? So it's not just the members who belong to one church in Black Mountain, North Carolina, but a sense that St. James Black Mountain is concerned about Black Mountain. And so, to what degree can be it priest or others have a sense of the neighborhood, the community that's not simply are our 300 members safe at St. James, but do we have an open heart for the community? And again, I've been heartened by some colleagues who I realize have done the work of being a neighbor in an ordinary time, who then have both credibility and network to be the neighbor in a crisis, right? I think too often in a crisis we think, "Wow, I would like to do X, Y, and Z," and you really are able to do that if you're the neighbor in the ordinary time, and you just know you know your neighbor, so then you know that they're missing, right? And so it requires the ordinary, everyday, just showing up work that is often looks boring, but is really how you test the nature and the strength of a community.
Mhm.
I think churches do have a really interesting and important space that they occupy, and that not only do you know a lot of community members and you then know their families and their networks, but as a nonprofit, as an NGO, essentially, like you also then are in touch with a lot of the resources in your community. And so you know those NGOs and you can manage those relationships. And then as a church, you are part of a broader group of churches. And so now you're part of a national or a regional network. Right. And so I think it's really a beautiful system to go from the broad, where somebody who's not in your region can reach in and help drill down into those spaces, because those churches in my
Mm-hmm.
how I see the world, really know the communities within each other. And I think my opinion of the Episcopal faith and how you all think about the world and people is that and creatures is that there aren't limits, there aren't edges to diocese, right? And that care extends to all of creation, and to all of the people. And so to me, it's almost baked in.
Mm. And I think there of what you were describing, Brian, that the ways that all the bishops of Province 4 came together to discuss how best to help. And I heard from a bishop from a coastal diocese who said, you know, we've got some experience with this stuff, and we can bring that knowledge, that experience to bear on these other dioceses that weren't expecting to be dealing with these impacts quite so urgently. Yeah.
Right. And Sarah, I love the idea, the way you're describing the church almost like is an ecosystem, right? And
Mhm.
if it's healthier, the healthier it is, it's more, it can be more impactful in a positive way for the crisis. And if we find ourselves anxious and disconnected from each other, then we're not as helpful in the crisis moment. So
Right. And I think so. There's a question in the chat, if I may, Andy,
Yeah,
that's
please.
kind of asking about climate change and politics. And I, to me, climate change extends so much further beyond politics. And I think one way to frame that, right, is in care and in safety. So how do we build safe communities and well-connected communities? What policies, what decisions do we need to be making collectively as well as individually that build our resilience and build our safety networks, in that, like, to build something to a 500-year flood line, again, to go back to that example, right? Um, that is that is a stronger community. You are a stronger community because you are thinking ahead, because you are thinking about what in reality is befalling other communities and applying that reality and that probability and possibility to your own. And so I think you could talk all day about building safe and resilient and well-connected communities without ever using the words climate change if you didn't want to, or if you didn't feel you needed to.
Mhm.
and I think too, I think if we think climate change is a political issue, then we've so underestimated what it really is.
Yeah.
It's a whole cultural issue, right?
Yeah.
And so I think again, we in that regard, we have to be even more expansive in how we talk about it and what it touches. Which again, I think then for me, when I think about the life of the church, I'm thinking of my friend Ellen Davis, who teaches at Duke, and her book Scripture, Culture, and Agriculture. She talks about this as an agrarian reading of the Bible. You know, that if I think if more clergy understood and lay leaders understood the whole story of God is a story of people and the divine and places, right? And land is not a backdrop in the biblical story, it's a character. I think
Mhm.
if we just fundamentally got that and inhabited that, then I think we would do a better job of saying this is a cultural issue. This is not simply a political right side, wrong side. It's so much more than that. Because if it's just a political issue, then it maybe is more important than education or less important than inflation, and that's not even fair. It's like it's all of those things. So
Boy, yeah, thank you. All of those really wonderful reflections. We're starting to get into a question about sort of why this matters or should matter to the church, and I want to get to that. There are a few questions in the chat and in the Q&A. dealing with kind of the practical question of how to come up with disaster preparedness or emergency preparedness plans. And I wonder if either of you have thoughts about how congregations or dioceses can facilitate that process of really coming up with sort of concrete plans for these kinds of situations.
I have learned the best way to come up with a hurricane plan is before the hurricane. And so again, I think one of the things we have to do with this is we have to keep our eyes on this topic, right? And both, dioceses that have done real work around these hurricanes and the networks that are already always there ready for the next storm. So I think this is where churches and church leaders have to be clear about what is it that we do well and where do we need help. And so with the church, it requires us to be pretty humble and knowing where to ask for help and where to find resources and not need to replicate them. So it's been a lot of asking a lot of folks really fundamental questions and knowing that because I think they know the church wants to get this right, have been helpful with that. So how to create those sorts of plans. And also just to be really, really clear from talking to colleagues on the ground, what we've seen, FEMA's working hard, churches are working, everyone's working hard. So the whole FEMA's not there, obviously that's a lie. That's not true. And so again, the church becomes a place to speak the truth and about who is showing up. And what we know is, again, people are showing up. But I think the plan and preparation is to think more than just how do we respond to the storm.
Yeah.
Yes.
To add some concrete to that, if I can.
Yeah.
So one way to, if you're sitting around in the church basement and you've got a bunch of scared folk who want to start thinking about these things, right? First step is you kind of think about, well, what are the possible risks, right? So what could befall us? High winds, floods, droughts, high temperatures, high humidities, wet bulb temperatures, like whatever. You kind of think crop failures, transportation, not being able to get in and out, grid failure. You start to think like what is kind of most, what do we think? And then from there you analyze, well, what are the risks? What do we think are, you assess like how well developed and robust are these systems? And you're going to have to ask people to help you with these, right? You're going to have to ask people, you're going to have to go out and start to learn then like, okay, well, water board, like like how much water do we keep in the reservoir and like how many days can that feed people and how have you figured out how that will withstand a drought, cracking dams or floods, et cetera, et cetera. So you really kind of drill down in those pieces. And then from there, working with those people who know things in your community, you begin to develop solutions. And there are lots of solutions out there. And oftentimes, if your local folks don't know them, you can look to the internet, you can look to greater organizations, you can look to places like FEMA, and they will have a solutions toolkit. There are a lot of toolkits out there that you can start to think of like, okay, well, this solution will fit for the risks that we think were high for and that we're not well adapted for at this moment. And you can begin to do that. But kind of identifying your champions and then going through that process is a way to do that in real time.
Yeah.
Also, let
yeah,
me just quickly also just say Episcopal relief and development. So right before the Hurricane Helene, I was talking to Josephine Hicks about some work they're doing, already realizing how climate change is impacting their work. That a part of what it means now for Episcopal relief and development to respond to disaster is to think about where climate refugees end up. So you're both responding to the place of hurt, but the people who've been hurt maybe are now, they might be in Memphis, right? They might be in Nashville. And so then I think that's where you have to go and talk to, as Sarah said, talk to the people who really know this at a deeper level because they help you think through the things you wouldn't think through. To think through that there might be people now living in Knoxville who are climate refugees connected to what happened in Bat Cave, North Carolina, and what it means for us to support them, not just to get back to Bat Cave, but while they're here. So yeah, I think talking to folks who do this all the time is really important.
Yeah. And Brian, actually, that's what I was going to mention, because someone in the chat mentioned Episcopal Relief and Development, and also mentioned the asset map that Episcopal Relief and Development and the Episcopal Church have been working on developing, and that in thinking about the importance of creating these networks, of knowing who's out there and who's doing what. The asset map is meant to be one tool for that, and the more kind of folks get their information and their ministries up on there, the more useful that tool is. But that's one resource in terms of kind of getting the lay of the land, in a sense, and getting some of that information. I'll address one more question before we turn to the question of sort of why. One of the questions that came in is about the Episcopal Church as a whole, and whether there will be a strong Episcopal presence in the climate conversation, and particularly now with a new presiding bishop coming in, whether that is going to be a key priority. I'll to exercise my privilege and address this to a certain extent, to say, actually, the climate change has been a big Episcopal priority since, well, for decades. Since 1991, the presiding bishop has sent a delegation to the United Nations climate conferences that happen every year to represent the Episcopal Church's values and priorities in some of those deliberations and conversations. And then presiding Bishop Curry, the outgoing presiding bishop, had creation care, including climate change, as one of his top 3 priorities, alongside racial reconciliation and evangelism as the top 3 priorities of the church. So I think, yes, all indications are that this is going to be an important priority for the incoming presiding bishop, Sean Rowe, but it also has long been a priority for the Episcopal Church, and I think that is something that, as we've all said, there are ways that the church can be doing better, can be doing more, but I think we can be proud that the church has, for its relatively modest size, has been a pretty significant advocate around these issues. Brian or Sarah, want to add anything to that?
So I'll just say that I believe presiding bishop-elect Sean Rowe, who will be presiding bishop in about a week and a half, my sense is he won't, that will continue to be a priority. I'm also aware that so much of what we do in this church is we share authority and we share leadership. And so knowing that what dioceses and parishes can do, we don't have to wait for him. Again, I think he will continue to fly that flag, and parishes and dioceses and people can often are the places that really kind of push and challenge our leaders as well, right? And so I think it will continue to be important. I have a 29-year-old son, and to somehow think about a church that's going to think about a church today saying this isn't a priority for us would be to say we really have no interest in the present or the future, basically, right?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
So as I said, I think a question that we've kind of skirted or touched on a little bit is this question of why. Why is this a priority for the church? Why is it a priority for us as individuals? So I'm gonna start with that second question. For you two personally, why does this matter specifically for you?
Go ahead, Brian.
Me, you. It matters to me because of love. Love the neighbor, love God, love God's world. It matters because of love. And yeah, both. I'm thinking of the people tonight who I know who are hurting because of this storm. And again, I think I think what draws us to this kind of work is the deep engagement when we've had in God's creation in the world and the beauty of the world, right? And so, and we don't want to hoard that for ourselves. I want that for everyone, right? Again, I don't want to live in a climate haven and let somebody else get clobbered, right? I want to live I want to live in a redeemed world. And on Saturday morning, I was in Martin, South Dakota, drinking really black coffee, and a young woman saw me in my collar and asked what kind of preacher I was, which is always a scary question because I know what's coming next. Um, then she asked about the book of Revelation, which again, I knew what's coming next. And she was curious if we were living in the end of time. And I gave the sort of not correct answer. And so for her, the fact that everything is collapsing and falling apart is like a good sign that somehow God is going to take us away. And for me, I'm really aware that when things are falling apart, the Spirit of God is going to stay here, right? God doesn't give up on God's creation. And so it matters to me because of love. And we don't give up on each other and we don't abandon each other.
Thank you.
Really
Yeah.
beautiful.
I can't imagine it not personally mattering to me. It's mattered to me since I can, as far back as I can remember, and not climate change, but just the world, right?
Mm.
The world that we live in and my connection to nature and my hope for all people's connection to nature and just this deep humility of like, I'm just a part, right? I'm just a part of all of this. I'm not above it. I'm not below it. I'm enmeshed in it. Um, and yes, love. Like I love it. I love the enmeshment. I love that it is all here and we are all a piece of it. Um, and I can't fathom not caring when I see beauty and not caring when I see hurt and not caring about my own present, past, or future, much less those of the people that I love and the people I don't know everywhere else in the world, right? Like everyone and everything matters. And
Mm.
that is why I care.
Yeah. Thank you. Those are both really lovely, beautiful answers. Thank you. Um, Beyond those personal reasons, are there reasons why this matters to the church as the church?
Again, I think yes, because God, the Spirit of God, the story of God has entrusted us to the care of what God has made.
Mm.
And so it matters to the church, or otherwise we are we're not taking on the work we've promised to take on, to care for the least of these, to love the world, to love the things that God has made in the world. And I think what happens too often is the church, this is my little commercial, the church is anxious about its future and thinks we have to make sure we have a future, and then we'll engage these other issues. If we could somehow engage the issues of urgency in our world in a responsive, loving, full-hearted way, it's not that it would save the church, but it would help us get clear about why does the church matter, right? And the church matters because the church shows up where the world is hurting, and that's where God shows up, and that's where the Spirit of the Christ shows up. And so if we lived that way and inhabited that posture, then it both would, I think, alleviate the monkey mind anxiety about saving the church, and at the same time be the kind of church that people don't expect us to be in a time where people need somebody to be an adult in the room, right? So,
Yeah.
To me, it matters to the church. And I'm going to use this as like maybe a big C church, like not just within the Episcopal faith, but just like the big C church, because how I see church is that the church is of the people for the people, of the planet for the planet, right? Like it is a community of community. And so it matters because your community is people. It matters because your community live in a place. It matters because those community members go out and do things and they have relationships and you want them to be loving and successful and rich and not rich in money, but like leading rich lives. Um, and it matters because one of the pledges I perceive as the promise of church is to stand in that place where making change and extending a hand and caring doesn't make monetary sense, right? It is that space to me that is supposed to be outside the economics. It's almost supposed to be outside of its own ego, right? It is there to show up to do the work that by definition is the work that is hard to do and that nobody could easily monetize or develop a business plan around or conceivably do for a reason other than because we care,
Mm,
right? And
yeah.
so to me, this is important to the church because we all live in the world and because that is the function of church.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you. I'm going to add something, although you all have both put it so powerfully and so beautifully. And it's really something that I think you both have reflected in thinking about how climate change is never just climate change, how it's connected to so many other things. And actually, this touches on a comment that somebody just posted as well, which is that um, already we're seeing and see clearly in North Carolina and Tennessee, as we have seen time and again with the effects of climate change, that the things that the church does, the things that the church is called on to do in our baptismal covenant, when we promise to respect the dignity of every human being, and I think some of us would probably be willing to expand that to include more than human beings as well, um, or in a place like Matthew 25, where we're commanded to give food to the hungry and care for the sick and give water to the thirsty. And all of these are things that are affected by climate change, that for the church to continue to do the things that it has always cared about and always been called to do, is going to require us to be honest, to tell the truth, and to respond directly to the challenges of climate change. It's so wrapped up, and of creation care more broadly. It's so wrapped up in everything that it means to be the church and everything that the church is called on to do. And so that that we can't really be the church. We can't really do church without also addressing that. And as I say, I think that's something that you both have really expressed very beautifully. So is there one or maybe just a couple of things? Are there key kind of ideas or insights that um, that churches need to be thinking about in trying to respond to or adapt to climate change? What might be sort of um, the key priority or the key takeaway for churches that uh, want to address somehow this reality that Hurricane Helene confronts us with?
I think a place where I would start is just sort of, centering. I'm going to start with the scriptures, centering this idea of what Ellen Davis says about scripture, culture, and agriculture, centering place and land and God's creation in the story of God, right? And just to get clear, so then what I hear preached in a sermon is the ways in which all of God's creation has a need for healing and reconciliation, and then how that impacts what worship looks like, and how it impacts how even our parishes are situated, how we think about our land, how we use our land. We've got Grace Chattanooga that does remarkable modeling of how it does urban arboretum and thinking about its property and redeeming that land. And you think about stewardship and how you think about where you invest your funds. Parishes that have funds to invest, do we invest in things that say they have long-term positive impact? To me, I think it's just to say, again, if we want the church's message of good news to be good news for all, for the long haul and the century, then climate change again won't be an issue. It'll be a lens through which the gospel responds.
Mm, yeah, thank you.
I think with any group of people, so maybe any church, anybody, there tends to be one way, maybe two ways that we really lean into doing our work. And so I'm going to talk about buckets again. And some of the ways that you might lean into doing your work, you might feel really comfortable and be really adept at, is like education, or is action, or is policy, um, or is, kind of the funds and the pieces of it, right? And I would advocate that we all be good at all of it, that we have to begin to lean into those places that we're not comfortable. We have to lean into those buckets that feel kind of icky, because we're just not very familiar with them. We don't feel very adept at them. And we need to lean into learning how to be a little bit more adept in. So we need to lean into that policy bucket. If that's not a place that your church is active, you need to start leaning in there. And maybe you do that through education, right? But you can't stay just in one of those buckets. Maybe you do it with some action, or maybe you're not a big action. You're more like, we do a lot of fundraising and we do a lot of education, but we don't really do the action, right? Like, I think we all need to kind of expand and bring all of those into the church and into the church's works and into the messages that you're bringing directly to your parish, your parishioners, your communities, and really embrace that. Like, it is wonderful and good that you would be acting in all of these ways, and that you have this message of care for all communities, through an environmental justice lens, right? For all people, all communities, globally, that you would want to bring that in, and that you could and should maybe, bring that in and lean into those. So to
Yeah.
me, those are some ways.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you. Thank you so much. So we're down to just a few more minutes. So if anybody has any other questions or comments that you want to throw into the chat or the Q&A, please go ahead and do that. Sarah or Brian, anything else that you would want to add? Any final thoughts or reflections?
I think again, I just want to applaud the fact that Sarah is doing the work she's doing at Sewanee, that Sewanee appreciates the amount of land it possesses and how we make use of it and how we inhabit it and how we protect it and how we um, as Wendell Berry says, sort of, invest in the millennium, how we think long term. And so, I do think the Episcopal Church, again, we are not a large religious body, but we do own a lot of land, and how we care for that land, be it parish church spaces, be it church camps and what we do in protecting land, but also I think what Sewanee is hopefully modeling. Because I think of it, I mean, Sewanee's a lot of land, but if you model that for people, or if a church models its use of land for parishioners, then I go home and think about my land or my neighborhood, or why conservancy matters. I do think I do think the ways in which we model for each other, that idea that, God's kingdom is already breaking in, and to kind of live in that flourishing while acknowledging where the hurt is still happening. So again, to be present to the hurt and keep modeling other ways to be. So I'm just grateful that Sewanee is saying this is a priority, and would encourage to let folks at Sewanee know that, thank you for making this a priority, because it will matter, especially if we're going to have young people saying, I want to go to college in a place that cares about these sorts of things. So,
Yeah.
Thank you. Just in light of, we're at the end of October, I just want to highlight that voting matters. Voting in local elections matters, and state election matters, and national elections matter. And thinking through these lenses, as a way to discern and evaluate candidates, I think would be, a positive.
Yeah. Very, very well put. We have one final question that popped up in the chat that I think is an important one, asking how churches can connect with each other around this work. I think there are a number of ways that can be done. Certainly, some dioceses have environmental ministers or missioners whose work is to develop these kinds of connections. One general convention resolution that came out over this summer that already incoming presiding bishop or presiding bishop-elect Rowe has voiced some energy for is the creation of eco-region networks that's going to be precisely focused on that kind of networking, that kind of connecting folks doing this work in different congregations. So I think keep an eye out for that. The Center for Religion and Environment certainly aims to be a hub for that kind of connecting as well. And so if you reach out to us to our email, and we should be able to try to help facilitate that as well. So I think that's a super important question. I think as Brian already indicated, a lot of the really important work of the church is happening on parish levels and diocesan levels. And I think being able to build those relationships, support one another, connect with one another is absolutely important. So thank you for that question. And yeah, I think that there are a number of ways that can happen. I want to echo Brian's gratitude for Sarah's work here at Sewanee, the really important work that she's doing in a number of areas, not just around climate change, but really helping Sewanee be a leader, I think, in environmental justice, in creation care, in climate justice. And I also want to express my gratitude to Brian for the important work that you do as a leader in the church around all these issues, not just responding in East Tennessee, but you've been an important voice for creation care in the Episcopal Church in the years that you've been bishop as well. And I and many others are very grateful for that. And just to both of you for your time tonight, for this conversation. It really has been a wonderful and really enjoyable conversation. I'm grateful to both of you for sharing your time, your wisdom, your insights with us all tonight.
Thank you for convening us, Andy.
You're welcome. It really, really has been a pleasure. And I also want to thank Christian, who is our tech guy who's been lurking, but without whom none of this would have happened. So we're grateful for that. And all the participants as well. Really glad to have so many of you with us. Thank you for your great questions and reflections. And I hope that this is the beginning of an ongoing conversation. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Andy. And Sarah, it's a pleasure to meet you, and thank you for your work at Sewanee. And Perry Turner in Copper Hill, if you'll email me, we can talk tomorrow. I just saw your question.
All right, great. Thank you. Thank you all so much.
Bye.